The Sun King dies, and with his final breath, an era ends. For 72 years, Louis XIV has ruled the kingdom with absolute authority, transforming a feudal realm into Europe's dominant power. Yet his magnificent reign leaves behind a poisoned legacy, crushing debts, endless wars, and a 5-year-old great-grandson who inherits a throne that gleams with gold as the nation crumbles beneath its weight. In the gilded halls of Versailles, courtiers whisper about the new regime as little Louis XV grows into a king who prefers hunting to governing. The nobility, tamed by the Sun King's elaborate court rituals, has forgotten how to rule their own estates, learning instead to perfect the art of ceremonial bowing. They dance through endless balls, as peasants in distant provinces struggle to survive harvest failures that aristocrats never witness. The Ancien Régime stands like an ancient cathedral, magnificent from a distance, but riddled with cracks that threaten its very foundation. Society divides into 3 rigid estates: the clergy who pray, the nobility who fight, and everyone else who pays. The first estate claims divine authority, accumulating vast landholdings exempt from taxation. The second estate clings to feudal privileges earned by medieval ancestors, collecting rents from peasants who can barely feed their children. The third estate, encompassing everyone from wealthy merchants to starving laborers, bears the crushing weight of supporting a system that offers them no voice in their own governance. In smoky Parisian coffeehouses, a new breed of thinkers gathers to challenge assumptions that have governed European society for 1,000 years. Jean-Jacques Rousseau scribbles revolutionary words that will ignite minds across the continent. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. His social contract becomes contraband literature, passed secretly from hand to hand among readers hungry for ideas that justify their growing discontent. Voltaire's razor-sharp wit slices through religious hypocrisy and monarchical pretension with surgical precision. Exiled in England, he witnesses a society where merchants can rise to prominence, and Parliament constrains the crown's power. His letters on the English provide compatriots with tantalizing glimpses of a world where birth matters less than merit, where commerce flourishes without aristocratic interference. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws offers blueprints for governmental reform that will someday inspire American revolutionaries and French constitutionalists alike. His theory of separated powers challenges the very concept of absolute monarchy, suggesting that freedom requires institutional checks on authority rather than relying on the wisdom of kings. Across the Atlantic, John Locke's ideas about natural rights and governmental consent filter into French intellectual circles through smuggled books and clandestine translations. His revolutionary notion that governments derive legitimate authority only from the consent of the governed contradicts everything the Bourbon monarchy represents. These Enlightenment philosophies spread through the kingdom like seeds on fertile ground, taking root in minds already prepared by daily experiences of inequality and injustice. In marketplaces and workshops, ordinary people begin questioning why accident of birth should determine lifetime opportunities. Why should a duke's worthless son inherit vast estates? Why should a merchant's brilliant daughter remain forever excluded from political participation? The 7 Years' War erupts, draining treasury reserves faster than summer rain soaks parched earth. Louis XV's ministers borrow enormous sums to finance global campaigns against British expansion, mortgaging the nation's future to pay for present ambitions. When peace finally arrives, the kingdom faces bankruptcy as Britain emerges triumphant, having seized territories in North America and India. Military defeat stings national pride, but financial catastrophe threatens survival itself. The crown's debt doubles then triples as interest payments consume ever larger portions of government revenue. Finance ministers come and go like seasonal fashions, each promising miraculous solutions before discovering that mathematics remains stubbornly immune to wishful thinking. Jacques Necker arrives as Controller General, bringing Swiss banking expertise to fiscal chaos. His revolutionary Compte Rendu publishes government finances for the first time in history, revealing the shocking truth about expenditures to a public that has never before glimpsed such secrets. Citizens discover that their taxes support not only essential services, but also massive pensions for court favorites, extravagant building projects, and foreign adventures that benefit primarily the nobility. The document spreads through the realm like wildfire, copied and distributed, until even provincial farmers understand how their sacrifices subsidize aristocratic luxury. Necker's revelations shatter the mystique surrounding official finances, transforming abstract grievances into concrete knowledge of governmental waste and corruption. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American colonists revolt against British taxation without representation. Enlightened observers watch with fascination as New World farmers and merchants translate theories into revolutionary practice. The American Declaration of Independence echoes words that Rousseau and Voltaire might have written, proclaiming that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Louis XVI, young and well-intentioned but fatally indecisive, decides to support American independence partly from anti-British sentiment and partly from misguided hopes that victory will restore national prestige. His finance ministers warn that intervention will bankrupt the kingdom, but the king chooses glory over fiscal responsibility. Gold flows across the Atlantic to arm Washington's soldiers as taxpayers struggle to meet their own obligations. The diamond necklace affair explodes, destroying what remains of the crown's reputation among the common people. Cardinal de Rohan, believing he can win Queen Marie Antoinette's favor, authorizes the purchase of an extraordinarily expensive diamond necklace, supposedly destined for the Queen. The elaborate fraud orchestrated by the Comtesse de la Motte exposes the corruption surrounding the court, making Marie Antoinette appear guilty of extravagance during national financial crisis. Popular pamphlets spread vicious rumors about the Austrian-born queen, portraying her as a foreign spy who influences her weak husband and squanders national resources on frivolous entertainments. L'Autrichienne becomes a hated symbol of aristocratic excess, blamed for every policy failure and governmental extravagance whether she bears actual responsibility or not. Agricultural crisis deepens the kingdom's suffering as harvest failures drive bread prices beyond reach of ordinary families. In Parisian markets, bakers' shops become battlegrounds where desperate customers fight over loaves that cost more than daily wages. Provincial towns witness food riots as hungry crowds attack grain convoys destined for wealthy neighborhoods, their own children crying from empty stomachs. The parlements, regional courts dominated by noble magistrates, choose this moment to assert their ancient privileges against governmental authority. They refuse to register new taxes, claiming constitutional rights to review edicts before implementation. Their opposition appears principled, defending traditional liberties against arbitrary power. But critics recognize that parlementaires protect primarily their own tax exemptions rather than popular welfare. And Robert Jacques Turgot, appointed Controller General, attempts fundamental economic reforms that threaten entrenched interests throughout the kingdom. His proposals to eliminate guild restrictions, remove internal trade barriers, and subject privileged estates to taxation promise rational solutions to national problems. But rationality proves insufficient against aristocratic opposition determined to preserve profitable traditions. Turgot's dismissal demonstrates the impossible situation facing reform-minded ministers. Meaningful change requires challenging powerful interests that possess sufficient influence to destroy reformers' careers. The nobility and high clergy unite to protect their privileges, ensuring that fiscal crisis deepens as solutions remain politically unattainable. Jacques Necker returns to power, but his second ministry faces even more desperate circumstances than his first. Government expenses continue exceeding revenues, despite various expedients and temporary measures. The American war, originally expected to last months, drags on for years as it consumes treasury reserves that the nation can no longer afford to spend. The Assembly of Notables convenes, summoned by Charles Alexandre de Calonne, to approve tax reforms that earlier ministers have failed to implement. This gathering of high nobles, clergy, and magistrates represents the kingdom's most privileged orders, precisely the groups that must sacrifice advantages for reform to succeed. Their predictable refusal to accept increased taxation confirms that the Ancien Régime cannot reform itself from within. Calonne's presentation reveals the true financial situation. Annual deficits exceeding 100 million livres, total debt approaching 4 billion livres, and interest payments consuming nearly half of all government revenues. The assembled notables express shock at figures that informed observers have long suspected, but they reject proposed solutions that would require meaningful sacrifices from privileged orders. Étienne Charles de Lomenie de Brienne replaces Calonne, inheriting an impossible task, implementing reforms that the Assembly of Notables has already rejected. His attempts to circumvent noble opposition through direct registration of edicts in parliaments provoke constitutional crisis that paralyzes government, while financial collapse accelerates. The parlements respond by demanding convocation of the Estates General, the ancient representative assembly that has not met since the early 17th century. Their call resonates throughout the realm as various groups discover shared interests in limiting authority, though for vastly different reasons. Nobles seek to preserve privileges threatened by reform. Commoners hope for representation that might address their grievances. Provincial assemblies begin meeting to elect deputies and draft cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances that will guide representatives in the forthcoming Estates General. These local gatherings become schools for political participation, teaching ordinary citizens to articulate complaints, propose solutions, and choose leaders from their own communities. In countless village meetings, peasants compile detailed catalogues of feudal obligations that impoverish rural communities. Seigneurial dues, church tithes, taxes, corvée labor requirements, and hunting restrictions that protect aristocratic game as crops face destruction. Urban artisans protest guild regulations that stifle economic innovation and protect established masters against younger competitors. The bourgeoisie, educated professionals, successful merchants, and minor officials emerge as the Third Estate's most articulate spokesmen. Lawyers, doctors, and businessmen possess both grievances against aristocratic privilege and rhetorical skills to express popular frustrations in compelling terms. They understand Enlightenment political theory and experience daily the limitations imposed by birth-based hierarchies. Parish priests, despite belonging officially to the First Estate, often sympathize more with their parishioners than with wealthy bishops who live like secular princes. These lower clergy witness poverty and suffering that their ecclesiastical superiors rarely encounter, creating tensions within the church that will soon explode into open conflict. As winter gives way to spring, the nation teeters on the edge of revolution. The king has promised to convene the Estates General in May, raising expectations throughout the kingdom though providing no clear solutions to the crises that necessitate such drastic measures. Financial collapse appears imminent, social tensions reach breaking points, and political institutions prove incapable of managing the transformations that circumstances demand. In workshops and marketplaces, on country roads and city streets, ordinary people sense that momentous changes approach. They cannot foresee the chaos and bloodshed that await, the wars and terror that will consume their children's lives, or the transformation that will remake not only their homeland, but the entire world. They know only that the old order is dying, and something new must be born from its ruins. The Ancien Régime has sown the seeds of its own destruction through decades of financial irresponsibility, social inequality, and political rigidity. Now those seeds prepare to sprout in the revolutionary spring of 1789, when the Estates General will convene at Versailles and unleash forces that no one can control. The fuse is lit, the explosion awaits. Spring arrives in Versailles with unusual anticipation, as the greatest palace in Europe prepares for an event that has not occurred within living memory. Carpenters hammer together benches in the Salle des Menus Plaisirs, creating seating for 1,200 deputies who will represent 25 million subjects in the first meeting of the Estates General since the reign of Louis XIII. The sound echoes through corridors, where courtiers whisper about the unprecedented gathering that promises to reshape the kingdom's future. Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès publishes a pamphlet that spreads through the realm like lightning through summer sky. What is the Third Estate? Poses the question that crystallizes months of growing resentment into revolutionary clarity. His answer resonates in every bourgeois salon and artisan workshop. Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it seek to become? Something. These words transform abstract grievances into concrete political demands. The Third Estate represents 98% of the population, produces all useful work, creates all wealth, yet possesses no meaningful voice in governance. Sieyès demonstrates with devastating logic that the nation and the Third Estate are essentially synonymous, making aristocratic privilege appear not merely unfair, but absurd. The pamphlet's circulation reveals the power of print to shape public opinion in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Cheap printing presses multiply ideas faster than authorities can suppress them, creating an underground network of political communication that operates beyond traditional control mechanisms. Coffee houses become laboratories of democratic thought, where shopkeepers debate constitutional theory with the sophistication of university professors. Elections for the Estates General transform sleepy provincial towns into centers of political awakening. Guilds that have concerned themselves solely with trade regulations suddenly find their members discussing natural rights and popular sovereignty. Village assemblies that normally limit themselves to local disputes begin drafting manifestos that challenge the fundamental assumptions of monarchical government. The electoral process itself becomes revolutionary education. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens participate in choosing representatives who will speak for their interests at the highest levels of government. Peasants discover they can vote for delegates who understand their struggles. Urban workers realize their voices matter in selecting spokesmen who share their daily experiences. Cahiers de doléances pour enter Versailles from every corner of the realm, creating an unprecedented catalogue of popular grievances and proposed reforms. These documents reveal the breadth of dissatisfaction with existing arrangements. Rural communities demand abolition of seigneurial privileges. Urban corporations seek elimination of internal trade barriers, and professional groups call for careers open to talent rather than birth. The cahiers also demonstrate remarkable consensus across geographical and social boundaries. Whether drafted in Norman villages or Provençal towns, in artisan workshops or bourgeois salons, the complaints echo similar themes: taxation without representation, legal inequality, economic restriction, and social injustice. The kingdom speaks with one voice in condemning the system that has governed it for centuries. May arrives with ceremony befitting the momentous occasion. The deputies process through Versailles in medieval costumes that emphasize the hierarchical distinctions the Third Estate increasingly questions. Nobles wear silk and feathers, clergy don religious robes, but the Third Estate appears in plain black cloth that deliberately emphasizes their exclusion from aristocratic splendor. Yet appearances deceive. Among those black-clad deputies march some of the most brilliant minds in the kingdom: lawyers who have studied constitutional theory, doctors who apply scientific reasoning to social problems, merchants who understand economic principles, and writers who command the power of words to move hearts and change minds. They may lack aristocratic titles, but they possess something potentially more powerful: ideas that can reshape the world. The opening ceremonies reveal the tensions that will soon explode into open conflict. Louis XVI delivers a speech that acknowledges financial crisis, but offers no vision for fundamental reform. He speaks as a benevolent monarch seeking his subjects' assistance, rather than as a constitutional ruler accountable to popular will. His words reflect the mentality of a man who still believes he rules by divine right, even as he asks for help from those he considers his inferiors. Jacques Necker follows with a detailed financial presentation that confirms what informed observers already suspect. The kingdom teeters on the edge of bankruptcy. His statistics provide concrete evidence for abstract complaints, demonstrating that fiscal irresponsibility has created a crisis that threatens national survival. Yet even Necker's remedies remain trapped within traditional assumptions about monarchical authority. The Third Estate arrives at Versailles with clear instructions from their constituents: vote by head rather than by order, ensuring that numerical superiority translates into political power. This seemingly technical procedural question actually determines whether the Estates General will preserve aristocratic privilege or create genuine popular representation. Everything hangs on how votes are counted. The nobility and clergy, recognizing the threat to their dominant position, insist on separate deliberation by estates, where their united opposition can block any reforms that threaten traditional privileges. They understand that voting by head would allow the Third Estate, reinforced by sympathetic nobles and clergy, to outvote conservative resistance. The constitutional deadlock appears immediate and absolute. Days pass in futile attempts to resolve the procedural dispute through negotiation. The Third Estate refuses to verify credentials or begins substantive business until voting procedures are settled. The privileged orders maintain their insistence on separate deliberation. Government officials attempt mediation, but offer no solutions that address the fundamental conflict between democratic and aristocratic principles. Frustration builds among Third Estate deputies who have traveled hundreds of miles to represent their constituents' interests, only to find themselves blocked by procedural maneuvers designed to preserve the inequalities they seek to reform. They sense that this moment represents their only opportunity to achieve meaningful change, making compromise feel like betrayal of the hopes placed in them. The deadlock breaks when the Third Estate takes revolutionary action that transforms the nature of the assembly. On June the 17th, following the proposal of Abbé Sieyès, they declare themselves the National Assembly of the nation, claiming exclusive authority to represent popular will. This bold stroke transforms a medieval institution into a modern representative body, while implicitly denying the legitimacy of privileged estates. The declaration reverberates through Versailles like thunder announcing an approaching storm. Nobles and clergy recognize immediately that accepting this claim would reduce them to private citizens whose opinions carry no special weight in national deliberations. The Third Estate has not merely challenged particular policies, but rejected the entire social order that has governed the kingdom for 1,000 years. 3 days later, the newly proclaimed National Assembly arrives at their usual meeting hall to find the doors locked and guarded by soldiers. Government officials claim they need the space for ceremonial preparations, but deputies recognize a transparent attempt to intimidate them into submission. The administration hopes that denying them meeting space will force them to abandon their revolutionary claims. Instead, they march to a nearby tennis court, where they take an oath that becomes the founding moment of constitutional government in the kingdom. Led by astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who emerges as their president, they swear never to separate until they have given the nation a constitution that guarantees popular rights and limits governmental power. The tennis court oath transforms a group of legal representatives into revolutionary legislators who claim constituent power to remake the fundamental law of the land. They no longer merely petition for reforms, but assert authority to create new institutions based on popular sovereignty rather than traditional privilege. The constitutional revolution has begun. Government response wavers between concession and resistance, reflecting Louis XVI's indecisive character and the conflicting advice he receives from ministers, courtiers, and family members. Some councillors urge immediate suppression of the assembly before their pretensions spread throughout the kingdom. Others recommend accommodation that might channel revolutionary energy toward moderate reform. The king attempts compromise by calling a session where he will announce concessions designed to satisfy popular demands without surrendering essential monarchical prerogatives. His proposed reforms include regular meetings of the Estates General, limitations on taxation without consent, and abolition of some feudal privileges. But he insists on maintaining separate deliberation by orders and preserving essential sovereign authority. The session backfires spectacularly when the Third Estate refuses to disperse after the king orders them to separate into traditional estates. When the master of ceremonies repeats the order, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, a noble who has allied himself with the Third Estate, delivers the response that captures revolutionary determination. We are here by the will of the people, and we will not leave except by the force of bayonets. These words electrify deputies who recognize that they have crossed the line from legal opposition to revolutionary resistance. They are no longer subjects petitioning their sovereign, but representatives of a sovereign people who claim ultimate authority over government. The confrontation at Versailles has become a test of will between competing concepts of political legitimacy. Meanwhile, economic crisis and political uncertainty create explosive conditions in Paris, where unemployment rises as businesses fail, and food prices climb beyond reach of ordinary families. Artisans who normally worry only about guild regulations find themselves unable to feed their children. Day labourers discover that wages cannot purchase basic necessities. The capital becomes a powder keg awaiting a spark. News from Versailles reaches Parisian crowds already angered by hunger and economic desperation. The political revolution occurring in the assembly resonates with people experiencing daily the failures of existing arrangements. They begin to see their personal struggles as part of a broader crisis that requires fundamental change rather than minor adjustments. Street orators appear in markets and public squares, explaining constitutional developments in language that ordinary citizens can understand. They connect abstract political principles to concrete grievances, showing how aristocratic privilege contributes to popular suffering. The revolution spreads from parliamentary debates to popular consciousness. Camille Desmoulins emerges as one of the most effective speakers, using his legal training and journalistic skills to translate complex political theory into compelling calls for action. His pamphlets circulate through working-class neighborhoods where literacy rates have risen enough to create mass readership for political literature. Ideas once confined to elite circles now reach artisan workshops and laborer taverns. The situation becomes more volatile when Louis XVI dismisses Jacques Necker, the finance minister who has become a symbol of reform among the common people. News of his removal spreads through Paris like wildfire, convincing many that the king has aligned himself definitively with aristocratic reaction against popular interests. The dismissal appears to confirm fears that compromise remains impossible. Crowds gather in the Palais Royal, where the Duke of Orléans has created a semi-autonomous zone where political discussion flourishes beyond royal control. Speakers denounce the dismissal as evidence of a conspiracy to crush the Third Estate and restore absolute monarchy. The mood shifts from protest to insurrection as speakers call for resistance against tyrannical authority. Sunday, July the 12th, witnesses the first serious clashes between civilians and soldiers as crowds attempt to prevent the departure of troops who might be recalled to suppress popular unrest. The barriers between political protest and physical resistance begin to crumble when constitutional conflict spills into the streets of the capital. Customs barriers around Paris become targets of popular fury as crowds attack the tax collection system that has long symbolized governmental oppression. The burning of toll houses represents more than economic protest. It marks the symbolic destruction of the Ancien Regime's authority over daily life. The revolution has moved from parliamentary halls to popular action. Arms become the crucial question as Parisians realize that political demands require physical force to become effective. The arsenal at the Invalides contains thousands of muskets that could equip a citizen militia, but the fortress appears impregnable to civilian assault. Yet hunger and desperation drive people to attempt what military logic declares impossible. The crowd that gathers before the Bastille on the morning of July 14th includes artisans, shopkeepers, labourers, and even some bourgeois supporters who see fortress walls as symbols of despotic authority. They demand gunpowder stored within the medieval castle, but Governor Bernard René Jourdan de Launay refuses to open gates that have never fallen to popular assault. Negotiations collapse when shots are fired, whether by defenders or attackers remains disputed, and the crowd storms the fortress with fury born of months of accumulated grievances. The Bastille falls not because of military superiority, but because revolutionary determination proves stronger than traditional authority. The medieval symbol of royal power crumbles before popular will. The governor's death at the hands of the crowd demonstrates that this revolution will not remain genteel debate among educated elites. Violence has entered the equation, transforming political disagreement into life and death struggle. The heads carried on pikes through Parisian streets announce that the old order's defenders will face physical consequences for opposing popular demands. News of the Bastille's fall spreads across the kingdom with unprecedented speed, carried by riders who gallop through the night to bring word of the impossible event to distant provinces. The symbol of royal authority has fallen to popular assault, proving that determined citizens can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles when united in common cause. The revolution has found its symbol in the liberation of the Bastille. Though the fortress contained only 7 prisoners and its military significance was minimal, what matters is not the strategic value of the victory, but its psychological impact on both revolutionaries and their opponents. The people have demonstrated their power to destroy the physical manifestations of oppression. King Louis XVI learns of the day's events from the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt, who brings news that Paris has fallen to popular insurrection. When the king asks whether this represents a revolt, the Duke corrects him with words that capture the magnitude of what has occurred. No, sire, it is a revolution. The Bastille's fall marks the end of the beginning, the transition from political protest to revolutionary transformation. The National Assembly has claimed constituent power, but the people of Paris have demonstrated that power ultimately rests with those willing to fight for their convictions. The revolution now has both legal authority and popular force behind its demands for fundamental change. August brings the great fear to the countryside, as rumors of aristocratic plots spread through rural communities, already strained by harvest failures and economic hardship. Peasants arm themselves against imaginary brigands supposedly sent by nobles to destroy their crops and force them into submission. The phantom armies never materialize, but the fear they generate produces real consequences. Manor houses burn throughout the realm as peasants attack the physical symbols of feudal authority. Seigneurial documents that record centuries of obligations go up in smoke, liberating communities from legal proofs of their subjugation. The revolution spreads from cities to countryside, from constitutional debate to social transformation. The National Assembly, meeting in emergency session on the night of August 4th, witnesses an extraordinary spectacle as noble deputies compete to renounce their feudal privileges. What begins as an attempt to restore order becomes a festival of renunciation as centuries of aristocratic advantage dissolve in a few dramatic hours. The legal foundations of the Ancien Régime crumble under the weight of revolutionary enthusiasm. The August decrees formally abolish the feudal system that has structured society since the Middle Ages. Seigneurial dues, church tithes, judicial privileges, and tax exemptions disappear in a single legislative session. The Assembly proclaims that all citizens are equal before the law, regardless of birth or social position. The revolution has achieved in one night what reformers have sought for generations. Yet even as they celebrate this triumph, revolutionary leaders recognize that declarations must be enforced and constitutional principles must be embedded in permanent law. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen emerges from weeks of debate as the philosophical foundation of the new order, proclaiming universal principles that apply to all humanity rather than merely to subjects of a particular monarch. The Declaration announces that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, that sovereignty resides in the nation, and that governments exist to protect natural rights rather than to serve monarchical convenience. These words echo American revolutionary principles, while adding distinctly continental elements that reflect European social conditions and philosophical traditions. October brings new crisis when bread shortages reach critical levels and rumors spread that the court plans to flee Versailles for a more secure location where royal authority can be restored. Parisian women responsible for feeding their families organize a march to Versailles that combines demands for bread with insistence that the king and queen return to Paris, where they can be watched by the people. The Women's March demonstrates that revolutionary leadership extends beyond educated male elites to include ordinary citizens whose daily struggles give them urgent stakes in political transformation. These market women possess no formal political training, but they understand intuitively that constitutional theory means nothing without practical improvements in their lives. Marie Antoinette becomes the primary target of popular fury as crowds blame her for the kingdom's sufferings. Whether fairly or not, she represents everything the revolution opposes: foreign influence, aristocratic excess, and resistance to popular demands. The queen who once advised the people to eat cake now faces subjects who have no bread and hold her responsible for their hunger. The royal family's forced removal to Paris symbolizes the triumph of popular sovereignty over traditional monarchy. The king, who once ruled from splendid isolation at Versailles, now lives under the watchful eyes of citizens who claim ultimate authority over government. The revolution has brought the monarchy down to earth, literally and figuratively. As the year ends, the foundations of the new order appear secure. The National Assembly has declared popular sovereignty, abolished feudalism, and established constitutional principles that guarantee individual rights. The people have demonstrated their power to destroy royal fortresses and compel monarchical obedience. The revolution seems to have achieved its goals without descending into chaos or tyranny. Yet careful observers notice troubling signs beneath the surface of revolutionary success. The violence that began with the Bastille's storming has not disappeared, but has spread throughout the kingdom. Economic problems persist despite political transformation. Foreign powers watch nervously as revolutionary ideas threaten to spread beyond national borders. The revolution has awakened forces that its leaders cannot fully control. The people who stormed the Bastille and marched to Versailles have tasted power and will not easily surrender it to new authorities, even revolutionary ones. The monarchy has been humbled but not destroyed, creating ongoing tensions between old and new forms of legitimacy. Most ominously, the revolution has created expectations that reality may not fulfill. Political equality has been proclaimed, but economic inequality persists. Individual rights have been declared, but collective problems remain unsolved. The gap between revolutionary promises and practical achievements creates space for more radical solutions to emerge. The nation has awakened, but it has not yet decided what kind of future it wants to create. The destruction of the old order proves easier than the construction of new institutions. As the revolution enters its second year, the real test begins. Whether the nation can build a stable government that preserves liberty without sacrificing order, that protects individual rights without destroying social cohesion. The seeds planted during this transformative year will continue growing in directions that even the most prescient revolutionary leaders cannot foresee. The nation that began this year as subjects of an absolute monarch ends it as citizens of a constitutional state. But the revolution has only just begun its work of remaking society and ultimately transforming the world. Dawn breaks over a transformed nation as the new decade begins, with radical fervor still burning bright in hearts across the realm. The National Assembly has abolished feudalism and proclaimed the rights of man, yet immense challenges await those who must translate inspiring declarations into workable government. The easy part, destroying the old order, has been accomplished. Now comes the harder task of building something better within the ruins. The civil constitution of the clergy emerges as the Assembly's boldest attempt to reshape society according to revolutionary principles. This sweeping legislation transforms the Catholic Church from an independent institution into a department of state, making priests into public servants who must swear loyalty to the nation rather than to Rome. Parish boundaries align with civil districts. Bishops face election by local assemblies, and ecclesiastical salaries flow from public treasuries rather than traditional tithes. The law appears logical to legislators who view the church as merely another corporation requiring rationalization. If feudal privileges deserve abolition, why should religious institutions maintain special exemptions vis-à-vis popular sovereignty? The clergy has claimed the largest share of national wealth, dominated education, and influenced politics for centuries. Radical principles demand that no institution escape democratic accountability. Yet the civil constitution unleashes forces that its architects never anticipated. Catholic tradition runs deeper than theory in communities where faith has provided meaning and structure for generations. Village priests who sympathize with radical goals find themselves torn amid religious convictions and civic duties when papal condemnation forces them to choose amid God and country. The oath of loyalty, required of all clergy, splits the church within constitutional priests who accept radical authority and refractory priests who maintain traditional allegiance to Rome. Families divide when beloved pastors refuse the oath, as communities fragment among those who support constitutional clergy and those who remain loyal to non-juring priests. The uprising has created a religious schism that will poison civic life for generations. Pope Pius VI's condemnation of the civil constitution transforms what began as administrative reform toward fundamental conflict amid transformative ideology and Catholic doctrine. The papal brief declares that constitutional clergy lack legitimate authority to perform sacraments, making marriages invalid and masses sacrilegious. Devout Catholics face an impossible choice amid civic loyalty and religious salvation. The schism spreads beyond clerical ranks to divide entire regions along religious lines. Western provinces, where traditional Catholic culture remains strong, become centers of counter-insurgent resistance, as areas with weaker church influence generally accept transformed changes. The uprising discovers that transforming institutions proves easier than changing deeply held beliefs rooted in centuries of tradition. Meanwhile, the assembly continues its systematic reconstruction of government according to rational principles. The kingdom divides into 83 departments of roughly equal size, replacing the chaotic patchwork of historic provinces with uniform administrative units designed for efficient governance. Ancient names like Normandy and Provence disappear on official maps, replaced by geographical designations that reflect radical antipathy toward traditional identities. Local administration undergoes equally dramatic transformation, as elected officials replace hereditary and appointed authorities throughout the realm. Mayors, judges, and administrators now derive legitimacy through popular choice, rather than aristocratic birth or bureaucratic appointment. The uprising extends democratic participation to levels of government that ordinary citizens encounter in daily life. Economic reforms attempt to dismantle the complex web of regulations that has stifled commerce for centuries. Internal customs barriers vanish, guild restrictions disappear, and free trade principles replace mercantile controls. The Assembly proclaims that every citizen possesses the right to pursue any profession or trade without restriction, based on birth, religion, or corporate membership. Individual merit and market forces will determine economic success. Yet economic liberation produces unexpected consequences as traditional protections disappear along with traditional restrictions. Journeymen who once relied on guild regulations to limit competition now face unlimited exploitation by masters seeking profit. Small producers discover they cannot compete with merchants who possess greater capital and broader connections. Economic freedom creates new forms of inequality, even as it eliminates old privileges. The countryside experiences particularly dramatic changes as feudal obligations vanish, and peasants gain legal title to lands they have worked for generations. Seigneurial courts disappear, hunting restrictions end, and common lands pass to village control. Rural communities taste freedom beyond aristocratic authority for the first time in centuries. Yet they must also assume responsibilities that feudal lords previously bore. Nationalist fervor sweeps across the realm as transformative ideology creates new forms of patriotic identity. The Fête de la Fédération celebrates the anniversary of the Bastille's fall, with ceremonies throughout the kingdom where citizens swear loyalty to the nation and the law. Local National Guard units parade with insurgent banners as crowds sing patriotic songs that replace traditional religious hymns. Louis XVI participates in these celebrations with apparent enthusiasm, taking the oath to uphold the constitution that limits his once absolute authority. Yet careful observers notice the monarch's discomfort with ceremonies that celebrate restrictions on powers he believes God has granted him. The monarchical arrangement creates an inherently unstable compromise amid democratic and traditional principles. The dynasty's growing isolation within the Tuileries Palace reflects the impossible position of a family that has lost its mystique without gaining genuine popular support. Marie Antoinette faces particular hostility through crowds who blame her for the kingdom's troubles and suspect her of treasonous correspondence with Austrian relatives. The queen, who once symbolized aristocratic elegance, now represents external influence and counterinsurgent conspiracy. Secret negotiations with European courts reveal the depth of monarchical disillusionment with radical constraints. Louis XVI seeks support via his fellow sovereigns who view developments in the nation with alarm, fearing that transformative ideas might spread toward their own domains. The Declaration of Pillnitz promises intervention to restore legitimate authority, though its actual commitment remains deliberately ambiguous. The declaration's publication inflames radical paranoia about aristocratic plots and external conspiracies. Patriots who initially hoped for peaceful reform now suspect that enemies within and without seek to destroy achievements via treachery and invasion. The uprising begins developing the siege mentality that will justify increasingly extreme measures against real and imagined threats. Economic problems persist despite transformation, as the assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated church lands, lose value via overissuing and public skepticism. Inflation erodes the savings of middle-class supporters, as unemployment remains high in cities where luxury trades collapse along with aristocratic consumption. The uprising has changed laws, but not economic realities. Food shortages continue plaguing urban areas where traditional supply networks have been disrupted by upheaval. The abolition of guild regulations removes quality controls that once protected consumers, as free trade policies allow grain to flow to areas offering higher prices, rather than to markets serving local needs. Transformative principles conflict with practical necessities of feeding large populations. Clubs emerge as crucial institutions for organizing radical opinion and coordinating resistance to counterinsurgent threats. The Jacobin Club, originally a gathering place for moderate deputies, evolves toward a network of affiliated societies throughout the kingdom, where citizens debate questions and monitor local officials. Club membership becomes a badge of patriotic virtue and insurgent commitment. The Cordelier Club attracts more radical elements who criticize the Assembly's moderate policies as insufficient to protect insurgent gains. Led by figures like Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat, The Cordeliers demand more aggressive measures against enemies of the people and advocate direct democracy over representative government. Such inflammatory rhetoric appeals to sans-culottes who feel excluded beyond power. These popular militants, artisans, shopkeepers, and labourers who wear long trousers instead of aristocratic knee breeches develop a unique culture based on militant egalitarianism and suspicion of wealth and privilege. The sans-culottes support the uprising, but question whether its bourgeois leaders truly serve popular interests. Such growing influence threatens to push the movement in more radical directions. International tensions escalate as European monarchs unite against transformative ideology that threatens authority everywhere. The Declaration of Pillnitz evolves toward more concrete military preparations, as émigré nobles gather at external courts to plan counterinsurgent invasion. The uprising faces the choice of moderating its policies to appease international opinion, or radicalizing its measures to defend itself against external threats. The flight to Varennes marks the monarchical arrangement's point of no return. On the night of June 20th, the dynasty attempts to escape Paris and reach the eastern frontier, where loyal troops might protect them beyond radical constraints. The elaborate plan requires precise timing and careful coordination, but it collapses when Louis XVI is recognized in the border town of Varennes by a postmaster who has seen his portrait on paper currency. The monarch's attempted flight shatters whatever trust remained amid the monarchy and the people. Citizens who once attributed sovereign resistance to bad advisors now recognize that Louis XVI personally rejects limitations on his authority. The myth of the sovereign as unwilling prisoner of radical agitators dissolves when his own actions reveal his fundamental opposition to transformative principles. The dynasty's forced return to Paris under guard transforms status beyond sovereigns to virtual prisoners of the nation they nominally rule. Crowds line the route back to the capital in hostile silence, broken only by placards declaring, "Whoever applauds the sovereign will be beaten, whoever insults him will be hanged." The monarchy has lost its sacred character without gaining democratic legitimacy. Debate over the sovereign's fate divides the assembly amid those who seek to maintain the monarchical arrangement and those who question whether the institution can survive such betrayal. Moderate deputies argue that punishing the sovereign would destabilize the constitution and invite external intervention. Radicals respond that mercy toward traitors encourages further treachery against the people. The massacre of the Champ de Mars demonstrates how quickly disagreement can escalate toward deadly violence. When crowds gather to demand the sovereign's abdication, the National Guard under Lafayette's command fires on unarmed protesters, killing dozens of citizens whose only crime was exercising the right to petition. The massacre poisons relationships amid moderate and radical elements and proves that authorities will use force against popular movements. The Constitution of 1791 represents the Assembly's attempt to create stable government that balances monarchical authority with popular sovereignty. The document establishes a limited monarchy with restricted sovereign powers, a unicameral legislature elected by property-owning citizens, and an independent judiciary. The sovereign retains executive authority, but cannot veto legislation permanently or dissolve the assembly without cause. Yet the Constitution rests on compromises that satisfy no one completely. Democrats object to property requirements that exclude poor citizens beyond voting, as monarchists resent restrictions that reduce the sovereign to a ceremonial figurehead. The document reflects the moderate deputies' hope that reasonable men can govern via rational institutions, but reason alone cannot resolve the fundamental conflicts amid democratic and monarchical principles. The Legislative Assembly that convenes in October 1791 faces challenges that its predecessor avoided via enthusiasm and external pressure. The new deputies lack the prestige of those who destroyed the Ancien Régime, yet they inherit problems that reform alone cannot solve. Economic difficulties persist, religious divisions deepen, and international tensions threaten to explode toward war. The Girondins emerge as the dominant faction in the new body, representing the educated bourgeoisie of provincial cities who support continued transformation within limits. Led by Jacques-Pierre Brissot and other eloquent speakers, they advocate aggressive policy to spread transformative principles and maintain domestic moderation to preserve property rights and social order. The opposition, who will later be called Montagnards or Jacobins, represent more radical urban constituencies demanding further democratization and stronger measures against counter-insurgent threats. Though still a minority, these deputies possess passionate conviction and popular support that makes them influential beyond numbers. The question of war dominates debate as tensions with Austria and Prussia escalate beyond diplomatic resolution. The Girondins argue that war will expose domestic traitors, unite the nation behind radical government, and spread liberty throughout Europe. Opposition warns that war will destabilize the arrangement and provide opportunities for military dictatorship or external conquest. Louis XVI supports war for his own reasons, hoping that military defeat will discredit radical government and restore his authority with external assistance. The Queen maintains secret correspondence with Austrian officials, providing intelligence about military preparations and encouraging invasion that might rescue the dynasty beyond insurgent imprisonment. The declaration of war against Austria in April 1792 marks a crucial turning point that transforms domestic uprising toward international conflict. Initial military disasters confirm critics' warnings about the dangers of combat fought by an army, undermined by emigration of officers and purges of aristocratic commanders. The Brunswick Manifesto threatens Paris with destruction if the dynasty suffers harm, but its intimidating language produces the opposite effect beyond what its authors intended. Instead of frightening radicals towards submission, the manifesto convinces them that compromise with external powers remains impossible, and that survival requires eliminating all domestic enemies who might assist invasion. Popular fury reaches boiling point when news arrives that Prussian armies have crossed the frontier as domestic traitors apparently coordinate with external enemies. The sans-culottes conclude that half measures have failed, and that only radical action can preserve insurgent achievements beyond destruction by the coalition of sovereigns and aristocrats. The insurrection of August 10th destroys what remains of the monarchy when crowds storm the Tuileries Palace and massacre the Swiss guards defending the dynasty. Louis XVI seeks refuge in the assembly, but his protective custody becomes actual imprisonment as radical authorities struggle to maintain order and prepare for war against external invasion. The fall of the monarchy eliminates the compromise that moderate radicals hoped would provide stable government. The uprising must now choose amid democratic republic and military dictatorship, amid popular sovereignty and elite rule, amid domestic reform and external conquest. The stakes have risen beyond anything the original reformers imagined when they called for the Estates General just 3 years earlier. The limited monarchy has failed because it satisfied neither democratic nor monarchical principles and created new problems that its institutions could not resolve. The uprising enters a new phase where compromise appears impossible, and where survival requires victory over enemies, both external and domestic. The moderate phase of the transformation is ending. The radical phase is about to begin. As summer turns to autumn in 1792, The sound of cannon echoes across the frontiers as crowds in Paris debate the fate of the former sovereign. The uprising that began with hopes for peaceful reform now faces the choice amid radicalization and destruction. The experiment has ended. The Republic is about to be born in blood and violence that will shock the world and transform the meaning of change forever. September rain falls on Paris as the cannon of Valmy echo across Europe, announcing that the world's oldest monarchy has given birth to something unprecedented. A republic founded on the radical principle that all men are created equal. The convention assembles in a city still reeking of blood and smoke, where the mob's fury has swept away 1,000 years of tradition in a single violent summer. The deputies who gather in the manège understand they face a choice between creating a new form of government or watching their nation collapse into chaos. The proclamation of the Republic on September 22nd, 1792, marks year one of a new calendar that will count time itself from this moment of liberation. The old Christian chronology disappears, along with the monarchy, replaced by revolutionary months bearing names that celebrate nature rather than saints. Vendémiaire for the grape harvest, Brumaire for the mists, Frimaire for the frost. Even time must be reborn to match the transformation of society. Yet the Republic inherits problems that proclamations cannot solve. Prussian and Austrian armies advance toward the capital, seeking to restore the Bourbon dynasty and crush the dangerous example that threatens every crowned head in Europe. Within the nation, counter-insurgent resistance spreads through regions where traditional Catholic culture rejects the new order's secular radicalism. The revolution faces enemies on every frontier, geographic, religious, and ideological. The September massacres cast a dark shadow over the Republic's birth, as Parisian crowds slaughter over 1,000 prisoners, suspected of counterinsurgent sympathies. For 5 days, improvised tribunals condemn aristocrats, priests, and common criminals alike to death at the hands of citizens who believe they are defending liberty against treason. The killings demonstrate that popular justice recognizes no legal constraints when the nation appears threatened with destruction. Olympe de Gouges watches these events with growing alarm, understanding that the revolution's promise of universal rights remains hollow as long as violence substitutes for legal process. Her declaration of the rights of woman and the female citizen challenges the masculine assumptions of radical ideology, demanding that liberty include all humanity regardless of gender. Yet her voice joins those of other moderate critics who find themselves increasingly isolated in a political culture that equates opposition with treason. The convention divides between the Girondins, who represent provincial bourgeois interests and seek to limit the radical trajectory, and the Montagnards, who speak for Parisian artisans and demand more aggressive measures against enemies both foreign and domestic. Between these factions sits the plain, deputies who prefer moderate policies but lack the courage to resist popular pressure when crisis demands decisive action. Georges Danton emerges as the Republic's most compelling orator, his thunder voice rallying citizens to defend their achievements against the coalition of kings arrayed against them. To conquer our enemies, we need audacity, more audacity, always audacity. His words electrify audiences who see in his passion the spirit needed to survive the approaching storm. Yet Danton's moderation on certain issues will eventually cost him his life when the revolution devours its own children. Jean-Paul Marat, the friend of the people, publishes daily screeds that inflame popular fury against aristocrats, moderates, and anyone suspected of insufficient enthusiasm for radical transformation. His newspaper becomes required reading for sans-culottes, who trust his paranoid vision of conspiracies. everywhere threatening their hard-won liberty. Marat's influence demonstrates how print culture shapes political consciousness in an age when literacy rates are rising, but critical thinking remains rare. The trial of Louis XVI forces the convention to confront the ultimate question: can a republic coexist with the former monarch, whose very existence challenges its legitimacy? The proceedings reveal deep divisions within the radical coalition, as deputies struggle to balance legal precedent with political necessity. Some argue that exile would suffice to neutralize the royal threat, while others insist that half measures invite counter-revolution. Maximilien Robespierre delivers the decisive speech that seals the former monarch's fate. Louis must die because the country must live, he declares, with the icy logic that will characterize his approach to radical justice. The incorruptible, as admirers call him, represents virtue incarnate. A man so devoted to transformative principles that he will sacrifice friendship, mercy, and ultimately his own life to preserve the Republic's purity. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793, sends shockwaves through every court in Europe. The scaffold erected in the Place de la Révolution witnesses the ritual destruction of sacred monarchy, as the guillotine's blade severs not merely a man's neck, but the divine thread that has connected heaven to earthly authority for millennia. European powers now understand that negotiation with this regime remains impossible. Only total victory can restore the proper order of things. Charlotte Corday's assassination of Marat demonstrates how violence breeds more violence in an endless cycle of revenge and retribution. The young Norman noblewoman believes she can save the Republic by eliminating its most bloodthirsty advocate, but her knife stroke only transforms the paranoid journalist into a martyr, whose death justifies even more extreme measures against enemies of the people. Radical justice becomes radical terror as the logic of violence overwhelms the rule of law. The Vendée erupts in counter-insurgent warfare that will claim hundreds of thousands of lives before peace returns to Western regions, where Catholic peasants reject the Republic's secular authority. The rebellion combines religious devotion with social resentment, as rural communities that have gained little from radical reforms take up arms against urban radicals who attack their deepest beliefs. Civil war spreads through provinces where ancient loyalties prove stronger than new ideologies. General François de Charette leads Vendéen forces with tactical brilliance that repeatedly defeats Republican armies sent to crush the rebellion. His success inspires similar uprisings throughout the West, creating a second front that drains resources needed to fight foreign invaders. The war becomes a struggle for the soul of the nation, as Catholics and Republicans battle for incompatible visions of what it means to be truly patriotic. The levée en masse transforms the Republic into history's first modern warfare state, as the convention orders universal military service to defend radical achievements. Young men will go to battle. Married men will forge weapons. Women will make tents and serve in hospitals. Children will turn old linen into bandages. Old men will be carried to public squares to arouse the courage of warriors. The entire nation mobilizes for total war. This mass conscription creates armies of unprecedented size, but numbers alone cannot guarantee victory without proper training, equipment, and leadership. Republican generals learn through trial and error that radical enthusiasm must be disciplined by military science if citizen soldiers are to defeat professional enemies. The amalgam system blends volunteer battalions with regular troops, creating the Grande Armée that will eventually conquer most of Europe. The Committee of Public Safety assumes dictatorial powers as the convention delegates authority to 12 men who will govern the Republic through its darkest hour. Robespierre gradually dominates this body through moral authority and rhetorical skill, transforming it into an instrument of his personal vision of radical virtue. The committee's green table becomes the nerve center of a government that claims democratic legitimacy while exercising absolute power. Bertrand Barrère, the Anacreon of the Guillotine, provides the committee with eloquent justifications for policies that would have horrified moderate insurgents just years earlier. His speeches transform necessity into virtue, arguing that temporary dictatorship serves democracy and that killing enemies preserves liberty. The rhetoric of radical terror develops its own logic that makes extreme measures appear not only justified but morally required. The law of suspects expands the definition of counterinsurgent activity to include virtually any criticism of government policy or insufficient enthusiasm for radical measures. Citizens who speak carelessly about grain shortages, question military requisitions, or express nostalgia for pre-radical customs find themselves denounced as enemies of the people. The Republic develops a surveillance apparatus that penetrates every neighborhood and watches every family. Marie Antoinette faces the tribunal with dignity that wins grudging respect even from her enemies. The former queen, now called simply the Widow Capet, bears little resemblance to the jeweled butterfly who once danced at Versailles. Months of imprisonment have aged her dramatically, but they have also revealed a strength of character that her critics never suspected. Her execution completes the symbolic destruction of the Ancien Régime. The tribunal becomes a machine for processing enemies of the people, as Antoine Fouquier-Tinville transforms legal proceedings into theatrical performances designed to educate citizens about the fate awaiting traitors. Trials last hours rather than days. Evidence matters less than necessity, and appeals are forbidden because the people's justice cannot err. The guillotine works over time as the definition of treason expands to include anyone who questions the Republic's infallibility. Provincial representatives on mission carry radical terror to regions where local authorities have proven insufficiently zealous in implementing policies. These commissioners possess unlimited authority to purge counterinsurgents, requisition supplies, and reorganize local government according to Parisian directives. Their proconsular powers transform the decentralized republic into a highly centralized state that controls every aspect of national life. Joseph Fouché demonstrates how radical terror can be used to advance personal ambition as well as ideological goals. His mission to Lyon results in mass executions that horrify even hardened insurgents, but they also establish his reputation as a man who gets results regardless of cost. The transformation creates opportunities for ruthless individuals to rise through violence and intimidation. The Republic's military situation gradually improves as mass conscription provides soldiers, while economic mobilization supplies armies with weapons and equipment. Victory at Fleurus opens Belgium to occupation, while successful campaigns in the Rhineland and northern Italy demonstrate that Republican armies can defeat professional forces when properly led and adequately supplied. Military success strengthens the government's domestic position by proving that radical methods produce results. Robespierre's Festival of the Supreme Being represents the Republic's attempt to create a new civic religion that combines Enlightenment deism with Republican virtue. The ceremony in the Champ de Mars features elaborate pageantry designed to inspire patriotic devotion while avoiding the atheism that has alienated religious believers. Yet the festival's artificial character reveals the difficulty of manufacturing spiritual conviction through decree. The Incorruptible's growing isolation reflects the impossible position of a man who demands moral perfection in an imperfect world. His speeches become increasingly abstract and accusatory, as he sees enemies everywhere and trusts no one completely. Former allies recognize that Robespierre's vision of virtue leaves no room for human weakness or compromise, making him as dangerous to moderates as to counterinsurgents. The economic policies of the Terror produce mixed results as price controls and requisitions ensure urban food supplies while destroying market incentives for agricultural production. The maximum fixes bread prices at levels workers can afford, but it also encourages farmers to hide grain rather than sell at artificially low rates. Radical economics demonstrates the difficulty of reconciling ideological purity with practical necessity. Jacques Hébert leads the ultra-radical faction that demands even more extreme measures against enemies of the people. His Père Duchesne newspaper appeals to sans-culottes, who believe the transformation has not gone far enough in destroying aristocratic privilege and religious superstition. The Hébertists' de-Christianization campaign attacks Catholic symbols and ceremonies with iconoclastic fury that alienates moderate Republicans. The execution of the Hébertists eliminates the radical left, but fails to satisfy moderate critics who see Robespierre as equally dangerous to Republican stability. Danton's faction represents those who believe the transformation has achieved its essential goals and should now consolidate its gains rather than pursuing impossible dreams of perfect virtue. The conflict between pragmatists and idealists splits the radical coalition. Camille Desmoulins, Robespierre's childhood friend, publishes Le Vieux Cordelier to argue for moderation and the restoration of legal protections that necessity has suspended. His articles eloquently defend the principle that even enemies deserve fair trials, and that government must respect individual rights even during emergencies. Yet friendship cannot protect him when logic demands his elimination. The execution of Danton and his followers marks the transformation's cannibalistic phase, as it devours its own children in pursuit of an impossible purity. The man whose voice once rallied the nation to defend its liberty dies because he questions whether liberty requires the perpetual sacrifice of human life. His death demonstrates that radical virtue has become radical tyranny. Robespierre's final weeks reveal a man consumed by paranoia and isolation, as former allies abandon him and enemies multiply around him. His last speeches ramble incoherently about conspiracies and virtue, while deputies calculate how to destroy him before he destroys them. The incorruptible has become incorrigible, a danger to everyone, including himself. The Thermidorian reaction begins when moderate Republicans unite with surviving Girondins to overthrow the man who has made the Republic synonymous with terror. The coup of 9, Thermidor, succeeds because even Robespierre's supporters recognize that his continued rule threatens their own survival. The transformation's most principled leader becomes its final victim as the guillotine claims the architect of radical justice. Robespierre's execution on July 28, 1794, ends the terror, but leaves unresolved the fundamental questions that have plagued the Republic since its birth: how to balance liberty with order, equality with property, virtue with pragmatism. The Thermidorians who inherit power must somehow preserve radical achievements while abandoning radical methods that have terrorized enemies and supporters alike. The Great Terror has claimed over 16,000 lives officially, with countless more dying in provincial massacres and civil wars that have torn the nation apart. Yet it has also preserved the Republic against enemies who would have destroyed it completely. Whether this terrible price was necessary for revolutionary survival or merely the product of ideological fanaticism remains a question that will haunt subsequent generations. As autumn arrives in year 2, the Republic survives, but bears scars that may never heal. The Terror has demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of popular democracy when faced with existential threats. The revolution has entered a new phase where moderation must somehow coexist with the memory of radical justice, where stability must be built on foundations laid with blood and violence. The guillotine still stands in the Place de la Révolution, its blade gleaming in the pale sunshine as crowds disperse and normal life gradually resumes. The Republic of Virtue has ended, but the Republic itself endures, forever marked by the terrible months when liberty nearly died in liberty's name. The transformation continues, but it will never again reach such heights of idealism or depths of brutality. The guillotine falls silent in Paris as summer winds carry away the screams and blood that have defined the Republic's darkest hour. Robespierre's severed head marks not just the end of one man's life, but the collapse of an entire vision of virtuous government that has consumed the nation for 2 terrible years. The Thermidorian survivors who emerge from hiding must now answer the question that haunts every post-terror society. How does one govern after virtue has become synonymous with murder? Paul Barras steps forward as the dominant figure among the new leadership, bringing cynicism where Robespierre offered idealism, pragmatism where the incorruptible demanded purity. A former nobleman who has survived by adapting to each phase of radical transformation, Barras understands that the Republic must choose between moderation and destruction. His talent lies not in inspiring speeches about virtue, but in the more mundane skills of compromise, corruption, and survival. The convention immediately begins dismantling the apparatus of terror that has held the nation in its grip. The Committee of Public Safety loses its dictatorial powers, becoming merely one administrative body among many. The law of suspects disappears, opening prison doors for thousands of citizens whose only crime was insufficient enthusiasm for radical measures. The surveillance networks that penetrated every neighborhood gradually collapse as neighbors stop denouncing neighbors. Yet the convention faces an impossible dilemma: how to preserve the Republic's achievements while repudiating the methods that made those achievements possible. The sans-culottes who provided muscle for radical policies still demand bread and jobs that the government cannot provide. Foreign armies still threaten the borders despite recent victories. Counterinsurgents throughout the countryside still dream of restoration, waiting for any sign of weakness to resume their campaigns. The White Terror sweeps through southern provinces as the pendulum swings violently in the opposite direction. Survivors of Jacobin persecution organize bands that hunt down former terrorists with the same ruthless efficiency once applied to aristocrats and priests. In cities like Lyon and Marseille, the streets run red again as victims become executioners, and executioners become victims in an endless cycle of revenge. These massacres reveal that the terror has not eliminated violence, but merely channeled it through official institutions. When those institutions collapse, violence returns to its more primitive forms: personal vendettas, family feuds, and communal hatreds that will poison civic life for generations. The Republic discovers that unleashing popular fury proves far easier than controlling it. Economic chaos deepens as the maximum price controls vanish, and market forces reassert themselves with devastating effect. Bread prices soar beyond the reach of urban workers who have grown accustomed to subsidized food during the terror. The assignats, already weakened by overprinting, become virtually worthless as merchants demand payment in gold or silver that ordinary citizens do not possess. Gracchus Barbeuf emerges as the prophet of a new form of radicalism that challenges private property itself, rather than merely aristocratic privilege. His conspiracy of equals attracts followers who believed the initial transformation betrayed its promise by preserving economic inequality alongside legal equality. Babeuf's vision of communal ownership anticipates later socialist movements, but his immediate impact remains limited to small circles of committed believers. The conspiracy's discovery and suppression demonstrate that the Thermidorian regime will not tolerate challenges from the left any more than from the right. Babeuf's execution eliminates the most articulate spokesman for economic democracy, but it cannot eliminate the social tensions that his movement represents. The Republic has learned to fear its own people as much as its external enemies. The framework of Year 3 attempts to create stable government through institutional mechanisms rather than virtuous leaders. The document establishes a 5-man directory as the executive branch, balanced by a bicameral legislature divided between a Council of 500 and a Council of Ancients. Property requirements limit voting rights to citizens wealthy enough to have stakes in maintaining order rather than promoting further upheaval. This careful system of checks and balances reflects the framers' determination to prevent any future concentration of power, like that wielded by the Committee of Public Safety. Yet the framework's very complexity creates opportunities for deadlock and confusion that will plague the Directory throughout its brief existence. Good government requires more than clever institutional design. It needs public support that the Republic increasingly lacks. The Directory inherits a nation exhausted by years of crisis and yearning for stability that its leaders cannot provide. The 5 directors, Barras, Jean-François Rubel, Lazare Carnot, Étienne François Le Tourneur, and Louis-Marie de la Révellière-les-Paux, represent different factions and interests that struggle to find common ground on fundamental questions of policy and principle. Corruption flourishes in this atmosphere of moral relativism, as officials who once claimed to serve virtue now openly pursue personal enrichment. Government contracts become sources of private profit, military supplies disappear into black markets, and public positions are bought and sold like commodities. The Directory's cynicism corrodes civic virtue more effectively than the terror's violence ever did. Foreign relations remain the government's greatest challenge, as European powers refuse to accept the legitimacy of a regime born from regicide and nurtured by popular violence. The First Coalition continues the war begun to restore the Bourbon monarchy, though member nations increasingly pursue their own territorial ambitions, rather than idealistic goals of counterinsurgent restoration. Military success provides the Directory's only reliable source of legitimacy, as citizen armies demonstrate their superiority over professional forces throughout Europe. Victory at Fleurus secures Belgium, and campaigns in the Rhineland and northern Italy expand Republican influence far beyond the nation's original borders. War, begun as a defensive necessity, becomes an offensive opportunity for glory and profit. The Italian campaigns reveal a new type of general who combines military genius with personal ambition in ways that threaten Republican institutions. Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 26 years old, transforms a secondary theatre into the war's decisive front through rapid marches, brilliant tactics, and shrewd diplomacy that forces Austria to seek peace. His victories make him a hero to soldiers who follow him with devotion bordering on worship. Bonaparte's success creates a dangerous precedent for civil-military relations, as his dispatches to Paris read less like reports from a subordinate than negotiations between equals. He negotiates treaties, organizes conquered territories, and enriches his troops through systematic plunder that makes military service profitable as well as patriotic. The Directory discovers that successful generals can become independent power centers that rival civilian authority. The Peace of Campo Formio demonstrates how military victory can reshape diplomatic relationships throughout Europe. Austria abandons its allies and recognizes conquests in exchange for territorial compensation in Italy and the promise of future cooperation. The treaty transforms the Republic into a dominant European power, capable of dictating terms to its former enemies. Yet peace brings unexpected problems, as the Directory must govern a larger territory, with more diverse populations, and manage an economy disrupted by years of warfare. Belgium's integration requires delicate balancing of local privileges with republican principles. The Rhineland's Catholic population resists secular reforms imposed by Protestant and deistic administrators. Colonial populations in the Caribbean islands demand rights that metropolitan authorities hesitate to grant. The Egyptian expedition represents Bonaparte's attempt to rival Alexander the Great by carrying republican arms to the ancient world and opening new routes to India that might compensate for colonial losses to Britain. The campaign begins brilliantly with the capture of Alexandria and victory at the pyramids, where Bonaparte tells his soldiers that 40 centuries of history look down upon them. Admiral Horatio Nelson's destruction of the French fleet at Aboukir Bay traps the expedition in Egypt while eliminating French naval power in the Mediterranean. The Battle of the Nile transforms a campaign of conquest into a struggle for survival, as Bonaparte's army finds itself cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Military adventure becomes military disaster through the caprice of wind and wave. The Second Coalition forms as European powers unite once again to contain French expansion that threatens the balance of power throughout the continent. Russia joins Austria and Britain in a grand alliance that coordinates attacks on multiple fronts while supporting counter-insurgent uprisings within French territory. The Directory faces its greatest military challenge since the dark days of 1793. Domestic opposition intensifies as economic hardship and military reversals undermine public confidence in the regime. The Clichy Club organizes moderate opposition that seeks peaceful revision of the framework to restore stability and order. These crypto-royalists do not openly advocate monarchical restoration, but their criticism of republican institutions provides ammunition for those who do. The coup of 18 Fructidor reveals the Directory's dependence on military force to maintain power against both left and right opposition. Barras allies with Bonaparte's supporters to purge moderate deputies and impose martial law that effectively ends government by law. The Republic saves itself through methods that destroy its democratic character, proving that institutional safeguards mean nothing without public support. The purge eliminates the last vestiges of legal opposition and demonstrates that the Directory rules through force rather than consent. Elections become meaningless when their results can be overturned by bayonets. Representative government becomes a facade concealing military dictatorship that grows stronger with each crisis. The Republic devours its own framework in the name of saving republican institutions. Economic recovery remains elusive as the Directory's fiscal policies fail to address fundamental problems of debt, taxation, and monetary instability. The replacement of assignats with mandats territoriaux provides only temporary relief before inflation resumes its destructive course. Government finances deteriorate to the point where administrative services collapse and military pay falls months behind schedule. Religious reconciliation proves equally difficult as the official church creates schisms within Catholic communities throughout the nation. Many priests refuse to accept the civil arrangement, and many believers reject official clergy as heretical usurpers. The Concordat remains years in the future as church-state relations fester, like an unhealed wound that weakens social cohesion. Provincial administration struggles with limited resources and uncertain authority, as prefects appointed through Paris lack local knowledge and local officials lack national perspective. The Ancien Regime's administrative chaos has been replaced by radical confusion that makes effective governance nearly impossible. Citizens lose confidence in government's ability to maintain order or provide services. The Directory's cultural policies attempt to create a republican alternative to both Catholic tradition and popular entertainment that might corrupt civic virtue. Official festivals celebrate republican holidays and discourage religious observances. Public education emphasizes patriotic duty over religious devotion. Yet these efforts remain superficial compared to the deep cultural changes needed to sustain republican institutions. Bonaparte's return galvanizes opposition to the Directory and provides a potential alternative to its failed leadership. His mere presence in Paris transforms the city's atmosphere as crowds gather to glimpse the general whose victories have made him a living legend. Politicians calculate how his prestige might advance their own ambitions, and he evaluates which faction offers the best opportunities for his advancement. The crisis deepens as news arrives of military defeats that threaten to undo years of conquest and expansion. Austrian and Russian armies drive forces out of northern Italy, and British fleets command the seas around Egypt and the Caribbean. The Directory's international policy lies in ruins as the Second Coalition achieves victories that seemed impossible just months earlier. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès emerges as the intellectual architect of revision that might preserve republican institutions and strengthen executive authority. His conversations with Bonaparte explore possibilities for reform that would combine military efficiency with civilian control, popular legitimacy with elite leadership. Yet their discussions reveal fundamental disagreements about power's proper distribution in a modern state. The conspiracy of 18 Brumaire takes shape as moderate republicans, military leaders, and former terrorists unite around the necessity of change and disagree about its direction. Some hope to revise the framework, others to replace it entirely. Some trust Bonaparte's republican convictions, others see him as a tool for their own advancement. All agree that the Directory cannot continue. The Directory's final months reveal a regime that has lost all capacity for effective governance and retains enough power to prevent alternatives emerging. Elections produce deadlock. International policy suffers defeats. Domestic order deteriorates and public confidence evaporates. The republic that emerged through the terror's ashes prepares to immolate itself on the altar of personal ambition. As autumn arrives in 1799, Bonaparte and his co-conspirators prepare to end the Directory's agony while beginning a new chapter in the Republic's troubled history. The coup that approaches will determine whether France moves toward constitutional monarchy, military dictatorship, or some hybrid form that combines elements of both. The Directory has failed, but what will replace it remains uncertain until the moment when soldiers surround the legislature and democracy surrenders to the man on horseback. The 5 years between Robespierre's death and Bonaparte's rise demonstrate that governing after terror requires skills that few politicians possess. The Directory's leaders proved capable of dismantling dictatorship, but incapable of building stable alternatives. Their failure opens the door for solutions that the original radicals never imagined and would have rejected with horror had they foreseen where their noble experiment would lead. Morning fog swirls around the chateau of Saint-Cloud as Napoleon Bonaparte prepares to end a decade of democratic experiment and replace it with something the world has never seen: a modern dictatorship disguised as popular government. The coup of 18 Brumaire unfolds not through dramatic speeches or violent confrontation, but through carefully orchestrated deception that transforms military ambition into civic necessity. The Republic dies quietly, suffocated by the embrace of the man who claims to save it. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès believes he has found the perfect tool to implement his vision of enlightened authoritarianism. The aging theorist who helped launch the transformation now seeks to complete it by balancing democratic legitimacy with executive efficiency. His elaborate plans for institutional revision require a general with enough prestige to command popular support but insufficient experience to threaten civilian control. Bonaparte appears ideal for this role until he reveals that tools can become masters. The conspiracy takes shape in salon conversations, where moderate Republicans, ambitious leaders, and practical administrators unite around their shared exhaustion with directory incompetence. Talleyrand provides diplomatic expertise, Fouché contributes police intelligence, and Lucien Bonaparte offers parliamentary connections that complement his brother's military reputation. Each conspirator pursues different goals, but all agree that the existing regime must be replaced. Military preparations proceed with characteristic precision, as Bonaparte recalls loyal officers from various commands. General Jean Lannes arrives from Italy, Joachim Murat brings cavalry expertise, and Claude Victor provides artillery support that might prove necessary if civilian authorities resist. These veterans understand that their leader's success will determine their own advancement in whatever government emerges through the current crisis. The psychological campaign begins weeks before the actual coup, as Bonaparte's supporters spread rumors about Jacobin plots, Austrian invasion threats, and directory corruption that endanger the Republic's survival. These stories, whether true or fabricated, create an atmosphere of crisis that makes drastic measures appear reasonable to citizens who have grown weary of instability and violence. November 9th dawns, with carefully planned movements that unfold like a military operation, disguised as legal process. The Council of Ancients, dominated by Bonaparte's allies, decrees that both legislative chambers must transfer to Saint-Cloud for their own security against imaginary threats in Paris. This relocation removes deputies from potential popular support and places them under military protection that could easily become military control. Bonaparte accepts command of the Paris garrison with theatrical reluctance, protesting his devotion to republican institutions, even as he positions troops to ensure their compliance with his wishes. His proclamation to the soldiers emphasizes duty to the framework and carefully avoids specifics about which framework they serve or whose interpretation of duty they should follow. The journey to Saint-Cloud becomes a triumphal procession as crowds cheer the general whose victories have made him a national hero. Citizens who have lost faith in legislative bickering and administrative corruption see in Bonaparte the decisive leadership that the Republic has lacked since Robespierre's fall. Their enthusiasm provides democratic legitimacy for actions that will destroy democratic institutions. Resistance emerges when deputies recognize that they face not institutional revision, but actual overthrow. The Council of 500 erupts in anger when Bonaparte appears before them with armed guards, his presence transforming legislative debate into military intimidation. Cries of "Down with the dictator" and "Outlaw the tyrant" echo through the Orangery as representatives realize they are witnessing the death of representative government. The confrontation reaches crisis when deputies surround Bonaparte, their fury so intense that he faints through stress and must be carried by his guards. This moment of vulnerability could have ended the coup if civilian authorities had possessed the courage to arrest him. but they hesitate just long enough for military loyalists to recover initiative and complete their mission. Lucien Bonaparte's speech to the troops provides the crucial justification for violence against civilian authority. As president of the Council of 500, he possesses democratic legitimacy that his brother lacks, allowing him to claim that terrorists have infiltrated the legislature and threaten the general's life. His words transform military intervention through sedition into patriotic rescue of legitimate government through factional corruption. Murat's grenadiers clear the orangery, with bayonets as deputies flee through windows, and scattered papers flutter in the autumn wind like leaves through a dying tree. The physical eviction of elected representatives symbolizes the end of an experiment in popular government that began with such hope 10 years earlier. Democracy expires not in glorious battle, but in undignified flight, through soldiers serving personal ambition disguised as public necessity. The rump legislature that reassembles approves whatever measures Bonaparte's supporters propose. Having learned that opposition risks both immediate danger and future exclusion through power, the surviving deputies vote to establish a consulate with 3 leaders, though everyone understands that real authority will rest with the man who commands military loyalty and popular enthusiasm. Bonaparte emerges as first consul in a carefully crafted arrangement that preserves republican appearances and concentrates actual power in his hands. Roger Ducos and Sieyès serve as second and third consuls, providing legitimacy and administrative expertise, and accepting subordinate roles that reduce them to decorative figures in a government designed to serve one man's ambitions. The new framework eliminates democratic participation and maintains republican rhetoric through institutions designed to channel popular will toward predetermined outcomes. Citizens vote for candidates selected by government officials. Legislators debate measures crafted by administrative experts, and courts enforce laws that serve state interests rather than individual rights. Democracy becomes theatre performed for audiences who gradually forget they once possessed real power. Administrative reform demonstrates Bonaparte's genius for creating efficient despotism through rational organization. The prefect system replaces elected local officials with appointed administrators responsible only to central authority. These modern proconsuls implement uniform policies throughout diverse regions and monitor public opinion and suppress any signs of opposition before they can develop into organized resistance. Educational changes indoctrinate future citizens with loyalty to the state rather than commitment to abstract principles of human rights. The Imperial University monopolizes higher education, and local schools teach patriotism, discipline, and obedience as the highest civic virtues. Knowledge becomes an instrument of control rather than a tool for liberation, reversing one of the Enlightenment's fundamental assumptions. Legal codification culminates in the Civil Code, which will become Bonaparte's most enduring contribution to human civilization. This comprehensive system of laws combines Roman legal principles with modern administrative needs to create a framework that can be implemented throughout Europe and eventually exported to colonial territories worldwide. Yet the code also reinforces social hierarchies and restricts individual freedoms in ways that contradict earlier declarations of universal rights. The Concordat with Pope Pius VII demonstrates Bonaparte's understanding that lasting power requires accommodation with traditional institutions that command popular loyalty. The agreement restores Catholic worship and maintains state control over clerical appointments, creating a partnership between throne and altar that serves both parties' interests at the expense of religious freedom and secular principles. Economic policies prioritize stability over innovation, as the consulate abandons radical experiments in favor of practical measures that serve immediate needs. The continental system attempts to destroy British commerce through economic warfare, but its effects prove more harmful to European consumers than to British merchants. State intervention replaces market mechanisms throughout the economy, creating prosperity for some and imposing costs on many. Military expansion transforms Republican armies into imperial instruments of conquest, as Bonaparte's success creates its own momentum toward ever greater conflicts. Victory breeds ambition, as each campaign opens new possibilities for territorial acquisition and personal glorification. The citizen soldiers, who once defended liberty against tyranny, become agents of domination over populations that never threatened their homeland. Opposition gradually coalesces around individuals brave enough to challenge the emerging dictatorship before it becomes irreversible. The royalist Cadoudal plot attempts to assassinate Bonaparte and restore Bourbon legitimacy, but its discovery provides justification for even more repressive measures against all potential sources of resistance. Terrorism begets tyranny, as emergency powers become permanent features of unlimited government. Republican generals who retain loyalty to democratic principles find themselves marginalized or eliminated as Bonaparte consolidates control over military hierarchy. Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, Jean-Victor Marie Moreau, and other veterans of the early campaigns discover that past service cannot protect them through present suspicion. The army that once served the people becomes the instrument of one man's will. The execution of the Duke of Enghien shocks European courts by demonstrating that Bonaparte will murder even innocent members of noble families to intimidate potential enemies. This calculated brutality serves notice that the new regime recognizes no limits of law, custom, or humanity when its survival appears threatened. Fear becomes the foundation of order, as mercy is redefined as weakness. Press censorship eliminates the free flow of information that democratic government requires to function effectively. Newspapers become government mouthpieces, and independent journalists face imprisonment or exile. Public opinion, once the driving force of radical transformation, becomes a manufactured product designed to serve state purposes rather than express popular will. The Senate's offer of the imperial title provides legal legitimacy for the final abandonment of republican institutions. Bonaparte accepts the crown and protests his devotion to democratic principles, performing elaborate ceremonies that mask dictatorship behind classical symbolism. The transformation through First Consul to Emperor Napoleon represents the complete perversion of popular sovereignty into personal rule. December 2nd, 1804, witnesses the coronation that symbolically completes the destruction of the Republic through the revival of autocracy in a new form. Notre Dame Cathedral becomes the stage for a ceremony that combines ancient ritual with modern propaganda as Bonaparte crowns himself emperor. The gesture of taking the crown through Pope Pius VII's hands and placing it on his own head dramatizes the principle that his authority derives through will rather than tradition. The proclamation of the empire eliminates whatever remained of democratic institutions and preserves their empty forms as decorations for absolute power. The Senate, tribunate, and legislative body continue to meet and debate, but their deliberations affect nothing beyond the salaries of their members. Representative government becomes an expensive theatre whose performances entertain audiences and real decisions are made elsewhere. International recognition gradually follows as European powers calculate that accommodation with the new regime serves their interests better than continued warfare. The Treaty of Amiens provides temporary peace that allows Bonaparte to consolidate domestic power and prepare for the renewed conflicts that his ambitions make inevitable. Diplomacy becomes another instrument of expansion rather than a means of preserving peace. The Legion of Honor creates a new aristocracy based on service to the state rather than accident of birth. Yet it also re-establishes social hierarchy that radical egalitarianism once sought to eliminate. Merit becomes the criterion for advancement, but merit as defined by those who already possess power and who use honors to reward loyalty rather than achievement. Provincial resistance gradually subsides as economic improvement and administrative efficiency convince many citizens that freedom matters less than personal security and material prosperity. The bargain between liberty and order resolves in favor of order, as war-weary populations accept diminished rights in exchange for competent government that provides services and maintains peace. Cultural changes reflect the regime's determination to create new forms of identity that serve imperial purposes rather than democratic values. Art, literature, and architecture celebrate military glory and administrative achievement, and ignore or suppress themes that might encourage critical thinking about governmental authority. Beauty becomes propaganda as aesthetic experience serves control. The transformation of holidays demonstrates how thoroughly the new regime has reversed the principles that once guided popular movements. Republican festivals celebrating civic equality give way to imperial ceremonies honoring military hierarchy. Bastille Day yields to Napoleon's birthday as the occasion for national celebration, symbolizing the replacement of popular liberation with personal rule. As the sun sets on the Republic, few citizens recognize that they have witnessed one of history's most successful destructions of democratic institutions through legal process rather than violent overthrow. Bonaparte has accomplished what counter-revolutionaries never achieved: the elimination of popular government with popular consent. The transformation that began with declarations of universal human rights ends with the coronation of a man who claims to embody the nation's will and denies its freedom. The uprising dies not through conquest or domestic rebellion, but through the voluntary surrender of principles that once seemed sacred to those who proclaimed them. Napoleon's genius lies not in military victory, but in persuading people to abandon liberty for efficiency, equality for order, and democracy for competent dictatorship. The empire rises through the Republic's ashes, phoenix-like, transformed yet recognizable, the fulfillment of radical energy directed toward ends that radicals never intended. 10 years after the execution of Robespierre, 5 years after the Directory's collapse, the people discover that they have traded the chaos of freedom for the stability of subjection. Whether this bargain serves their long-term interests remains a question that only history can answer, but the immediate result seems clear. The nation that taught Europe the meaning of popular sovereignty has voluntarily returned to the ancient pattern of personal rule, proving that democracy's greatest enemy may be democracy itself. The last candle flickers in the Palace of Versailles as workers dismantle the Hall of Mirrors, transforming what once symbolized absolute power into a museum of vanished grandeur. 15 years have passed since angry crowds stormed the Bastille, yet the world they created bears little resemblance to the utopia that radicals once imagined. The transformation that began with such noble aspirations has produced an empire more powerful than any monarch ever wielded, raising fundamental questions about human nature, democratic government, and the price of social change. The Ancien Régime lies buried beneath the rubble of its own contradictions, never to rise again despite the nostalgia of émigré nobles shivering in foreign courts. Feudalism has perished not only in the homeland, but throughout the territories where Bonaparte's armies carry their banners. No power on earth can restore the world of seigneurial dues, hereditary privilege, and legal inequality that shaped European society for 1,000 years. The clock of history cannot be turned backward, however much traditionalists might wish otherwise. Legal transformation proves the most durable achievement of the radical decade, outlasting the governments that created it and spreading far beyond the borders where it originated. The civil code becomes a model for legal systems throughout Europe and eventually reaches every continent where European influence penetrates. Its principles of legal equality, property rights, and administrative rationality reshape societies from Spain to Poland, from Haiti to Louisiana. Civil equality before the law destroys the formal hierarchy that once divided society into rigid castes determined by birth rather than merit. The son of a peasant can now compete with the descendant of nobles for positions that were once reserved for aristocratic bloodlines. Legal disabilities based on religion vanish as Jews, Protestants, and Catholics gain equal standing in courts that no longer recognize spiritual authority over temporal matters. Property rights receive sacred protection that shields individual ownership from both feudal obligations and communal claims. The bourgeoisie, who led the transformation, ensure that their economic interests gain legal sanction that makes future confiscation extremely difficult. Land becomes a commodity that can be bought and sold freely, rather than a feudal trust that binds families to ancient obligations. Administrative rationality replaces the chaotic patchwork of local customs that once governed different regions according to traditions that varied from village to village. Uniform laws, standardized procedures, and centralized authority create predictable conditions for commerce, travel, and communication that stimulate economic development throughout the territory. Social mobility increases dramatically as careers open to talent rather than birth, allowing individuals to rise according to their abilities rather than their ancestry. The imperial university, military academies, and administrative schools provide pathways for advancement that bypass traditional gatekeepers who once monopolized opportunities for their own families and clients. Yet social transformation remains incomplete as gender hierarchies survive the destruction of aristocratic privilege. The civil code enshrines male authority within families, denying women the legal equality that men have gained through the elimination of noble status. Olympe de Gouges' vision of universal human rights yields to Napoleon's preference for domestic order based on masculine supremacy. Economic development accelerates under conditions of legal security and administrative efficiency that the new order provides. Internal trade barriers disappear, creating a national market that allows specialization and exchange on an unprecedented scale. Roads improve, canals multiply, and nascent industries benefit from protection against foreign competition and access to continental markets. The continental system, despite its ultimate failure, demonstrates how economic policy can become an instrument of international struggle. The attempt to strangle British commerce through European cooperation prefigures later efforts at economic integration, though Napoleon's methods rely on military coercion rather than voluntary agreement. Religious settlement through the Concordat establishes a pattern of church-state relations that influences Catholic countries throughout the 19th century. The agreement preserves Catholic worship and clerical hierarchy while subjecting church personnel to state authority in ways that reduce religious independence without eliminating spiritual influence entirely. Educational reform creates the foundation for modern mass schooling that will eventually spread throughout the Western world. The emphasis on patriotic loyalty, practical skills, and social discipline shapes curricula that prioritize civic utility over individual creativity or critical thinking. Knowledge becomes a tool for creating useful citizens rather than free-thinking individuals. Military innovation transforms warfare through the combination of mass conscription, professional leadership, and nationalist motivation that makes citizen armies superior to mercenary forces. The levée en masse introduces the concept of total war, where entire populations mobilize for military effort, fundamentally altering the relationship between states and societies. Tactical developments pioneered during the period influenced military doctrine for generations, as officers throughout Europe study the campaigns that carried tricolour banners from Madrid to Moscow. Artillery concentration, rapid marching, and coordinated combined arms operations become standard practices that shape conflicts well into the industrial age. Nationalist ideology emerges as one of the transformation's most powerful exports, inspiring liberation movements throughout Europe and eventually around the world. The principle that peoples sharing language, culture, and history possess the right to govern themselves challenges multi-ethnic empires and provides justification for independent struggles from Ireland to Greece. The concept of popular sovereignty travels beyond European borders to influence independence movements in Latin America, where Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and other liberators adapt radical principles to local conditions. The Declaration of the Rights of Man becomes a template for governmental documents throughout the Americas. Democratic ideals survive Napoleon's dictatorship to inspire later generations who seek to complete the unfinished work of human liberation. The promise of equality before the law, representative government, and individual rights provides a standard against which future societies can measure their achievements and identify their shortcomings. Liberal governance develops through the synthesis of radical theory with practical experience, creating governmental frameworks that balance popular participation with institutional stability. The separation of powers, bills of rights, and federalist structures that emerged during this period influence the design of free governments throughout the democratic world. International law begins to reflect the principle of national self-determination rather than dynastic legitimacy as the basis for territorial boundaries and governmental authority. The Congress of Vienna attempts to restore traditional arrangements, but it cannot eliminate the idea that peoples, rather than princes, should determine their own destinies. Cultural transformation proves equally significant as artistic expression breaks free from aristocratic patronage to serve broader audiences with diverse tastes and interests. Literature, music, and visual arts explore themes of individual struggle, social conflict, and human possibility that reflect the democratic spirit of the age. Romanticism emerges partly as a reaction against the rationalist assumptions that guided radical reforms, yet it also reflects the period's emphasis on individual emotion and personal experience over traditional authority and inherited wisdom. The movement celebrates creativity, authenticity, and subjective truth in ways that complement rather than contradict democratic values. Scientific advancement accelerates under conditions of intellectual freedom and institutional support that the new order provides. The abolition of guild restrictions, religious censorship, and aristocratic privilege creates space for innovation and discovery that produces important advances in chemistry, physics, mathematics, and natural history. Medical progress benefits from the rationalist approach to human welfare that characterizes enlightened administration. Public health measures, hospital reform, and medical education improve the physical condition of populations throughout Europe. contributing to demographic growth and urbanization. Technological development receives encouragement through patent protection, educational investment, and market expansion that stimulates invention and entrepreneurship. The foundation of modern industrial society emerges during this period as mechanical innovation combines with legal security to create unprecedented productive capacity. Women's rights remain largely unrealized, despite the period's rhetoric of universal human equality. The participation of women in crowd actions, economic boycotts, and cultural movements demonstrates their capacity for citizenship. Yet legal and social restrictions continue to limit their opportunities for full participation in civic life. Slavery poses an even more glaring contradiction to the principle that all humans possess natural rights to life, liberty, and happiness. The abolition of slavery in the Metropolitan Territory and some colonial possessions represents partial progress, but the continuation of forced labor in other territories reveals the limits of radical commitment to universal freedom. Colonial populations throughout the empire experienced the contradiction between liberation ideology and imperial domination, as administrators impose European laws and customs on societies with different traditions and values. The transformation's benefits remain largely confined to European populations, while colonial subjects bear its costs without sharing its rewards. Memory of the transformation becomes a contested battlefield, where different groups seek to claim its legacy for their own purposes. Liberals emphasize its contribution to representative government and individual rights. Socialists stress its attack on economic inequality and class privilege. Nationalists celebrate its role in creating popular sovereignty and cultural identity. Conservative critics argue that the period demonstrates the dangers of radical change and popular government, pointing to the terror's violence and Napoleon's dictatorship as inevitable consequences of democratic excess. Their warnings influence theory and practice throughout the 19th century, as leaders seek to avoid the extremes that characterize the transformation. The question of whether the tremendous costs in human life and social disruption were justified by the achievements remains fiercely debated by historians, philosophers, and citizens who must evaluate the trade-offs between stability and progress, order and freedom, tradition and innovation. Economic inequality persists despite legal equality, as market capitalism creates new forms of wealth concentration that may be more flexible than feudal hierarchy, but are no less real in their effects on individual opportunity and social mobility. The bourgeois victory over aristocracy does not eliminate class distinctions, but transforms their basis and character. The cycle of expansion and reaction that characterizes the period establishes a pattern that will repeat throughout the modern era as societies oscillate between periods of rapid change and conservative consolidation. The transformation provides both inspiration for future reformers and warnings about the difficulties of implementing radical visions. International influence spreads through multiple channels as exiled radicals, traveling intellectuals, and conquering armies carry new ideas throughout Europe and beyond. The period's combination of ideological appeal and military power creates conditions for rapid diffusion of concepts that might otherwise have remained confined to their country of origin. As the sun sets on the age of democratic transformation and Napoleonic empire, the world confronts a future shaped by forces that this remarkable period has unleashed. The old world of hereditary monarchy, feudal privilege, and religious authority has been shattered beyond repair. Yet the new world of democratic equality, rational administration, and individual rights remains incomplete and contested. The promise of human liberation that inspired the original radicals continues to challenge societies throughout the world, creating expectations that governments must satisfy or face the consequences of popular disappointment. The genie of democratic aspiration, once released from its bottle, cannot be forced back into confinement by those who fear its power. Whether humanity will fulfill the transformation's promise of universal freedom and equality, or succumb to the temptations of power and privilege that corrupted its original vision, remains the central question of the modern age. The answers will determine whether this remarkable period represents humanity's first step toward genuine liberation, or merely another example of noble ideals betrayed by human weakness and ambition. The world that emerges from the ashes of the Ancien Régime bears the permanent imprint of 15 years that changed everything. The transformation may have ended in empire, but its legacy lives on in every charter of rights, every declaration of human dignity, and every struggle for freedom that follows in its wake. The real conclusion of this story lies not in the past, but in the future that each generation must create for itself.